Hello there! Today, I'd like to teach you about the artifact power system and its problems. This, I feel, has been a growing issue amongst raiders in World of Warcraft, and, at time of writing, I saw a particularly explosive discussion regarding this on Twitter, which included the following post by community manager Law. So why is this an issue in the eyes of hardcore raiders? Is it an issue at all? Let's approach this from a wider perspective, more focused on design than opinion, and see what we can learn. Before we begin though, a note about my personal experience, since it is very likely going to influence the way I approach this subject. I've been raiding on and off since Wrath of the Lich King, and I've been in groups that approach raiding casually, groups that are middle of the road, and, more recently, a group that has pushed fairly, but not incredibly hard at mythic raiding. This is the extent of my experience. I'd like to think that I've dipped my toe into raiding at most, but not all levels. Alright, so before we begin to examine the problems pointed out by critics of the system, let's go over how artifact power works from the ground up. You receive an artifact weapon shortly after starting the Legion storyline, with others being available fairly early in the leveling curve, and begin receiving artifact power for your weapons by doing just about everything. Questing, dungeons, battlegrounds, arenas, exploration, and more. Once you reach level 110, you have more options for getting artifact power. World quests, dungeons of every difficulty, looking for raids of every difficulty, dungeons, arenas, more exploration, one-time story quests like in Suramar, and more. Pretty much every source of artifact power can be increased through artifact knowledge, a system in place in your class order hall. Here, a player can spend resources on artifact research notes work orders, which will increase the amount of artifact power gained from all sources by an ever-increasing amount. This increase can reach a maximum of 24,000%, turning even the most mundane of artifact power rewards into heapings of the stuff. Just note that it will take several months of handing in research note work orders to reach this point, as each one takes a few days to complete. But this benefit is counteracted by the way in which artifact power is spent. After a certain amount is put into a weapon, a trait point will unlock, allowing the player to add power to their artifact. Each subsequent trait costs more than the last, to the point where later traits can cost upwards of several million artifact power. This system balances itself out. It costs more to unlock new traits, but you're earning more with artifact knowledge. That said, it takes a lot of time anyway, or a lot of grinding artifact power to reach the later traits in a weapon. So, what were the goals here from a design perspective? Well, aside from providing another means to increase character power at maximum level, it's also a system that rewards play sessions. At any point, regardless of a player's gear or progression, they can log on and gather some artifact power to increase their strength. Since the artifact power system is so deep, the player is never bound by any kind of time-gating mechanic. This is a system inherently designed to last throughout the entire expansion for a typical player, keeping contents of all kind relevant, since as long as it still drops artifact power, it has inherent value to the player. So where is the problem for serious progression raiders? Well, in short, the later traits in their weapons. These traits are very, very powerful. Every artifact weapon has a series of traits that unlock when all other golden traits have been filled. Occasionally called paragon points, these traits offer flat increases to throughput, damage, healing, or survivability. For raiders, these traits are incredibly attractive for two major reasons. First, in a mythic raiding environment, in order to create exciting challenges, everything is extremely tightly tuned. Bosses like Guam are given enrage timers that are incredibly short. Mechanics will deal immense, barely survivable amounts of damage, and enemies will have terrifying amounts of health, designed to take sustained focus fire to even have a chance of defeating. This brings up the second reason why these paragon points are so attractive to raiders. The first one will grant a 5% flat increase in throughput, while subsequent traits will increase this up to 20 traits, 54 overall, and a 15% increase to throughput. Even once all 54 traits have been unlocked, there are unconfirmed rumors that future traits might be added, making artifact power useful to finished weapons even now. It's difficult to overstate how crucial these throughput increases can be in a mythic environment, where everything is so tightly tuned at the start of a raid's life cycle. Consider that most cutting-edge raiding teams will enter raids severely undergeared, with the Emerald Nightmare as a possible exception, since they're not going to farm a lower difficulty for gear before making serious attempts at the hardest modes. These players need every advantage they can get in those early weeks to defeat mythic bosses quickly and earn high progression ranks, which are marks of prestige and success in the social raiding scene. These ranks are the reason these cutting-edge guilds exist, to kill bosses as quickly as possible. This is called the progression race, or the raiding race, or whatever you'd like to call it. These first few weeks when a raid is released are big for these guilds, since this is when the race happens. We saw it when Emerald Nightmare and the Trial of Valor launched, we will see it when the Nighthold launches, and we've seen it in the past as well. Let's return to our wider perspective to go into more depth about the system's advantages and disadvantages. Assuming that most players won't have the time or want to constantly grind artifact power to reach that 54 trait maximum, the system itself acts as a carrot on a stick for every player, always giving them a reason to play the game. That's big from a design standpoint. When you have a system in an MMO, it doesn't always apply to every player, but artifact power pretty much applies to everyone, which is very big. It also serves as a consolation prize in dungeons if you don't win a piece of gear that you want. At least you get artifact power. Additionally, thanks to accumulating artifact knowledge increases, even the most casual of players can start to unlock the later ranks in their weapon as time passes. No matter how progressed a player is, be it dungeons, raids, battlegrounds, arenas, or something else, there is always a means for an individual player to make their character stronger in either a solo or a group environment. Finally, this system is practically unlimited. Since it takes so much artifact power to finish a single weapon out, let alone every weapon for a class, most players will have their multiple artifact weapons as a reason to do anything they want. If it's Legion content, chances are high that it will provide artifact power, which is a reward for doing them. This can be a big draw for players. Unfortunately, this final advantage is also where the system is somewhat dissonant with its more die-hard followers. A player can, through great effort, grind for a very, very long time using Mythic Plus dungeons, which have no lockout period, to reach 54 points in their artifact weapon, and that is what a lot of top-end raiders are doing. It's sucking a lot of enjoyment out of the game for them. Now, it's very easy to look at this and just say, well, this isn't really a problem. If it's not fun, don't do it, and that is a very reasonable reaction to have. But let's dig deeper into this. There are big downsides to this philosophy for these top guilds in the world, and even those that are seeking to emulate them. This is something that is pretty common, as most successful raiders will live by a mindset of improvement, and for this reason, this issue can very easily affect a wider number of players than just the high-end raiding scene, since that scene and the players within it receive so much attention from the community. Now, rather than attempt to explain this in my own words, since I'm not a member and I never have been a member of a cutting-edge raiding guild, I'm going to directly quote Zolvolt of Exiled Legion. He writes, "Keep in mind that even within raiding, the experiences that players have are vastly different. Raiding and guild environment and the level of expectations differ greatly from guild to guild, and many of even our top 50 world and regional guilds have a long history of raiding in this game. The game requires too much of me outside of raid times. This complaint stems off of the character progression being seemingly endless due to the artifact power system. I say seemingly because while there is no cap, the cap on artifact knowledge and the high amount of artifact power required for completing a weapon are supposed to deter players from flat-out grinding, as it would take an unreasonable amount of time to finish. However, this falls flat when that goal becomes realistically reachable if you grind for hours and hours a day, every day of the week. And this is actually possible because of Mythic Plus. You can grind these forever for a very high yield of artifact power. Several high-end raiders have spent every waking moment they can to maximize their main spec weapon for this, and they hate it. Nobody enjoys this. There are multiple reasons to do this, however. Cutting edge. Every high-end raid guild has one common expectation. Do whatever you can that will give us a leg up in progression. This has been seen through the evolution of split runs at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, and is seen in current-day World of Warcraft as grinding for an unrealistic amount of time to finish your artifact weapon. Both are feasibly possible, so then the expectation quickly becomes to do it. This might seem silly to players who are okay with raiding without that cutting-edge expectation, but these are guilds that have had this one goal, this one mindset, for years. Nighthold. Nighthold is just around the corner. it's easy to see that a guild with fully completed artifact weapons going into Nighthold is going to have a big advantage over a guild full of raiders who have not completed their artifact weapons. So, pushing for those completed weapons is going to come naturally to your high-end raiders. The race. Raid progression is a race of prestige in not only Warcraft but nearly every competitive MMORPG. It is a progression race after all. Some guilds choose to ignore things like WoW Progress and other progression-oriented ranking sites, but even if this aspect of the game isn't supported officially, it is a big part of the raiding community. Progress affects everything from your raiders' mindsets and attitude to your recruitment and your guild publicity, which in turn helps your recruitment. Guilds and players also pay attention to high-end guilds. Let me give you a perfectly realistic scenario of how then don't know life the game negatively impacts any high-end guild. I'll use my guild as an example. If Exiled Legion, who has historically been anywhere from top 50 to top 30 US, decides to lower their expectations of what players must do outside of raid time to lower artifact requirements alone, if players have even 5 less traits across the board, that alone will have a sizable impact on the in-raid experience. Players who just barely died would have been saved thanks to a bigger heal. DPS requirements that are a struggle to meet would have been much easier. The amount of 1% wipes on difficult bosses that we've seen in high-end from the past are less frequent when players min-max their character as much as possible, which is impactful on raid progression, and again, the progression race. But we're saying that Exiled Legion decides to take it easy, right? Well, let's say they go from being a top 30 to a top 50, or worst case scenario, guilds pushing harder than them push them to top 60. This does several things to the guild. 1. Recruitment gets worse. Players look at this as a declining guild and it becomes more difficult to get players. 2. Current raiders who are unhappy with the lowered expectations will look to raid in another guild, spots that will be harder to fill with declining recruitment. And 3. Raider attitudes and mindsets go down. Players who are used to being in a high competitive guild will not sit happily as their progression, their race, goes down from what they've been used to. Frustration, anger, and toxicity amongst players is very likely to arise from this. Using Exiled Legion as an example, it was built on we out-progress guilds who raid more hours than us because we make up for it with our raid prep, strategy, leadership, and our play in the raid zone. Because from the Burning Crusade until Legion, Exiled Legion was a 9-hour raid guild. This was a big pushing point for this guild. But now, with so much out-of-raid time character progression, meaning artifact power and mythic plus, there are all these speed bumps that are just slowing down these guilds that have never had this insane time requirement, because raiding at the high end truly did not require a high amount of time if you did the prep and played properly. Min-maxing your character did not require that much time. Legion changed this aspect way too much. Now these guilds, these exiled legions in the world, have had their game, their raid, changed because in order to min-max that character, in order to continue keeping up with those guilds around you that have all this time, it's now much harder. Your raiders who never had to play this much are now struggling because they don't have the time. Among the negative points I listed above, we also add on that players are not just flat out quitting because of time requirements, but also because of loss of enjoyment for the game. After all, the systems Blizzard implemented in Legion have changed the game that they were enjoying up until this point, and these guilds and these players have lived off of a set of high expectations. But now that the game systems themselves encourage unrealistically high expectations that are realistically reachable, albeit at the expense of all of the players' time and enjoyment, one can clearly see how this is a recipe for disaster. So no, just don't know life it isn't a good answer. An answer like this also implies that all of these problems just don't exist, which in itself is insulting to say to not only these raiders, but also to the guild leaders that work so hard to keep these guilds running despite the nonsense hoops that Blizzard is making them jump through. But what kind of answer has the community received for this problem? Merely opinions that they don't have to try so hard or give up so much of their time, that their problems don't exist. Zolvolt brings up a very well-reasoned argument here, and this has in turn led to a question that I feel is the heart of this issue. Since this is widely perceived to be a player-created problem with ranks, guild strength, and prestige dependent upon fast progression, should Blizzard protect its hardcore players from themselves? This is a very difficult question to answer, as players will always surpass design expectations. As long as there isn't a hard limit on what a player can do, a dedicated player will simply keep pushing the game until it stops them, or it breaks. World of Warcraft has long provided hard limits to raiders. Weekly raid and mythic dungeon resets, daily normal and heroic resets, for example, provide ways to prevent players from endlessly grinding to improve their character. Legion is the first time this restriction has been lifted in such a grand manner, with 2 systems, artifact power and legendaries. It's possible to endlessly grind for these, so dedicated players are inevitably going to do so. Alright, so before we end, let's go back to the wider perspective, comparing the advantages we've already discussed with this new disadvantage. It's important to remember that the high-end raiding player base is, although specific numbers are impossible to come by, a fairly small section of the overall player pool. Despite this, they are also a vocal, popular, and well-respected section of the player pool, and a lot of players enjoy mastering their classes. They enjoy doing well in dungeons and raids, and progressing as much as they can, which in turn will have a lot of these raiders, even if they are not cutting-edge raiders, examining the behaviors of these top-end raiders, seeking to emulate them. From personal experience, Legacy Reborn, the guild that I used to raid in, would do this all the time. Whenever we would approach a new mythic boss, we would start a forum thread that pretty much always began with, well, how did the cutting-edge teams handle these bosses? So, as a designer looking at this from a wider angle, what is best? Do you make a change to prevent more dedicated players from burning out thanks to what can be called a player-created issue? What would that change be? Will doing so have unintended side effects, like penalizing players that haven't done the grind already? Or will doing nothing create a spiral of issues that could lead to long-term problems for the competitive scene? What does a system like this do to the barrier of entry for the competitive scene, and is that healthy or unhealthy? And finally, should you encourage players to play so intensively if they want to be competitive? These are questions that I can't answer, but it's certainly an interesting topic to discuss. Hopefully this video has informed you somewhat as to what's going on, so that you can form your own conclusions about the situation regardless of your own position in-game. Just remember that whether you agree or disagree with the issues raised by the cutting-edge community, try not to dismiss either side's points out of hand. A discussion is always more enjoyable and more enlightening than an argument. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the World of Warcraft.